Welcome to You're Not Broken, Just Rewiring, a free audiobook podcast by me, Glenn Ostlund. Chapter 16: The Ego, the Gods, and the Stories That Shaped the Sky. Is it just me, or is this whole experience of being human stitched together by stories we don't even know we're telling? So here we are at Chapter 16. Let's pause for a moment and play with that number. 16. It's 8 plus 8. And 8, turned on its side, looks a little like the infinity symbol. So maybe 16 is where infinity meets infinity. If we follow it through, then every step on this spiral has been a meeting of infinities. Every chapter a convergence of eternal forces reaching out toward one another in time. In Chapter 13, infinity met infinity through the four fundamental forces: gravity, electromagnetism, the strong nuclear force, the weak nuclear force. And we explored time itself, not as a linear progression, but as a relational unfolding, a scaffolding upon which the patterns of existence could emerge. In Chapter 14, infinity met infinity again. Molecules became stable enough to create the first cell that said yes. Celly and Mitch. The great mitochondrial merge, a relational blueprint of cooperation encoded in rhythm and breath. This was Lemuria, not a continent but a pattern, a memory, a harmonic state of coherence where individuality and communion were not at odds. In Chapter 15, infinity met infinity in the evolution of the neuron. A new kind of speed, a new kind of sensing, a new way to communicate across distance, across difference, across time. And with that came the dawning of self-awareness, metacognition, and reflective thought. The rise of Atlantis, not as a fallen civilization, but as a symbolic phase in our nervous system's development, where we learned to look back at ourselves, to name, to narrate. And now, here we are in Chapter 16, another meeting of infinities. In this chapter, we'll explore the myths that shape our experience of the world. In Act 1, we'll explore these myths of fall and fire and fracture. In Act 2, we'll explore what makes stories so powerful in the first place. And in Act 3, we'll take a deep dive into one particular place where story and neurology create meaning in our lives: regret. The looping, haunting voice of hindsight. The internal myth that something should have been different, and that you should have known better. All of this in the spirit of understanding ourselves as a nervous system that has been evolving from the very beginning. Because you are not just a person with a story. You are a story-making being built from ancient relational patterns. You are the product of atoms that learned to bond, molecules that learned to breathe, cells that learned to stay. You are a symphony of signals, and the voice in your head is just the narrator, not the whole self. Act 1. When myth becomes meaning. In Chapter 15, we mentioned the term Aryan and how it was hijacked. How a word rooted in an esoteric attempt to describe human evolution across spiritual epochs became warped into a doctrine of supremacy and violence. And maybe there's no better example of what this chapter is about: the power of myth to shape behavior, to twist identity, to anchor entire cultures in a story that becomes indistinguishable from reality. That's what myths do when they go unchecked. They become invisible. They operate as truth. According to Helena Blavatsky, we are currently living through the age of the fifth root race, the Aryan root race. Not in any nationalistic sense, but as a stage in collective evolution. It is the epoch of mind, of reflection, of ego, a time when the individual begins to awake to its own separateness, its own story-making powers. The first and second root races were etheric, elemental. The third, Lemurian. The fourth, Atlantean. And now, the fifth, us, still carrying echoes of the others, but with something new, the capacity to observe our own thoughts and to choose. This idea maps cleanly onto another mythological system, the teachings of Ra. Ra describes this stage of evolution not in racial terms, but in vibrational ones. They call it third density, the density of choice, the density of self-awareness, a stage of consciousness where beings awaken beneath a veil of forgetting, cut off from the love that formed them, from the cellular coherence of Lemuria, from the interwoven mind of Atlantis, and in that forgetting, they begin to choose, towards service to self or service to other. Just as molecules once stabilized their relationships in ways that gave rise to the first cell, and those first cells formed enduring bonds that made more complex life possible, maybe this is what we're doing now. Blindly, awkwardly, unconsciously choosing the relationships of being in the world that resonate with us. Choosing what feels most safe or most familiar. And maybe those choices, like those molecular patterns, will lead to something greater than we can see yet. According to Ra, that's what this density is really about. A subtle shift of intention that begins to build momentum. They call it polarity. And in part one of this book, we introduced a metaphor to help visualize this moment. Leonardo Determinist Vinci and the tip of whimsy. The entire universe, we imagined, is the work of a great cosmic artist. Every stroke shaped by deterministic laws, genetics, environment, epigenetics, trauma, culture, all of it flowing from a hand we cannot see. But at the very tip of that brush, where the paint touches the canvas, there is a space created to pause. There is play. There is variation. There is choice. This is the tip of whimsy. This is where attention becomes power, where a shift in focus can change the entire tone of a stroke. We don't get to choose the hand. We don't get to pick the weight of the brush or the patterns that shaped it. But we can notice. We can lean just a little, just enough, a tilt toward connection or toward control, a breath that softens or a clench that armors. And yet, these leanings are never made in isolation. We are pulled, we are nudged, we are shaped by stories we didn't choose, myths that wrapped around us like weather. And we feel these forces in our nervous systems, in the tightness in our chest, in the ways we brace for belonging, in the patterns we repeat without knowing why. The stories we don't know we're telling. When I studied mythology as a folklore graduate student, I was taught to understand myth not as lie or superstition, but as sacred story. Myth was alive, continuously shaped by the communities that held it. The term was communal recreation. To study myth was to study the values and beliefs of a people at the level of their nervous system. And yet, that's not how most people use the word. In everyday language, myth means something false, something naive. The myth of the American dream, the myth of control. We've come to treat myth as a mark of delusion, something to outgrow, debunk, or discard. It's a slur we aim at other people's beliefs, not ours. Our beliefs we call truths. Theirs we call myths. And so, without realizing it, we live in myths we no longer recognize as myths. We inherit them. We embody them. But we don't usually question them because they automatically feel true. That's what a good story does. It feels true. It lands in the nervous system with a sense of belonging. It rewards you with serotonin when it confirms what you already believe. It floods your body with dopamine when it resolves your uncertainty. A story, especially one shaped by your group, can feel safer than your own sensations, more trustworthy than your own gut. And when that happens, we no longer entrain to the signal beneath the story, we entrain to the story itself. That's when the fall begins. Because humans don't just tell stories, we become them. And one of the most dominant stories we've collectively become, particularly in the modern post-industrial world, is what might be called the scientific myth of consciousness. This myth tells us that awareness is an emergent property, that until a brain reaches a certain level of complexity, there is no experience, no subjectivity, no sensation. Molecules, cells, atoms, these are treated as inert matter. The steam of consciousness only rises once the neurological water has reached the appropriate boil. Until then, there is no self, no center, no feeling. That's the myth. It has shaped everything from artificial intelligence to end-of-life care. It defines how we treat animals, plants, forests, oceans, and even each other. And like all myths, it is powerful precisely because it is invisible. But it's not the only myth. There is another myth, older, stranger, less neatly packaged. Panpsychism. The idea that consciousness, or something like it, is a fundamental feature of reality. That experience is not something brains produce, but something existence expresses. That atoms have some form of inwardness. That molecules have patterns of resonance. That cells feel. That even before brains, life was already sensing, already responding, already knowing how to be. Panpsychism tells a very different story. It doesn't reduce consciousness to complexity. It doesn't see life as mechanical or mindless. It sees consciousness as woven into the very fabric of what is. Because that's what myths do. They give us a lens through which to interpret what we see. They set expectations. They guide perception. They shape what we accept, what we reject, and what we can even imagine. And whether we live inside the myth of scientific materialism, or the myth of panpsychism, or try to straddle both, those stories live in us. These myths are not just narratives. They are neural architectures, and they will shape how we interpret what comes next. Echoes of the Fall. Eden, Prometheus, and the Memory of Harmony. Long before we framed ourselves as separate from nature, there were stories. Stories that whispered of a time when all things moved in rhythm, when life was not dominated by a single species, but held in a delicate reciprocity. When consciousness, subtle, panpsychic, cellular, was not confined to the brain, but diffused across the ecosystem. One of these stories is the Eden myth. It lives at the heart of Western sacred imagination, a story so familiar we sometimes forget to listen. But what if Eden is more than a theological artifact? What if it's a memory, a symbolic survival of an earlier state of resonance, Lemurian perhaps, in which all living things participated in a symphony of relational balance? In that garden, there was no shame, no judgment, no self-conscious separation. The tree of knowledge had not yet been tasted. The default mode network had not yet been wired. And so there was no looking back, no spirals of regret, no narrator rehearsing what went wrong. The bite of the fruit changed everything, not because the fruit was evil, but because it introduced a new feature: metacognition. The sudden self-reflective loop that allowed humans to know that they knew, to see themselves seeing, to judge themselves judging. And with that awareness came a cost: shame, fear, blame, separation. The nervous system, once entrained to the signals of the whole, now tuned itself to the flickering projections of the individual self. We explored this in Chapter 15, in The Myth of Atlantis, when the neuron emerged as a tool of incredible advantage. Colonies of cells that once relied on interoceptive signaling and mutual responsiveness could now leap into coordinated actions at speeds never before seen. They could also split, fracture, forget. Eden remembers what that forgetting felt like, and so does Prometheus. In Greek mythology, Prometheus is a titan who defied the gods by stealing fire from Mount Olympus and giving it to humanity. Fire, in this myth, was more than flame. It was divine knowledge, creative spark, disruptive potential. By gifting it to humans, Prometheus elevated them beyond their natural station, igniting the engine of civilization itself. But the gods did not see this as benevolence. They saw it as rebellion. For his transgression, Prometheus was condemned to eternal torment, his liver devoured daily by an eagle, only to regenerate and suffer again. In ancient traditions, the liver was seen as the seat of emotion, instinct, and vital force, making this punishment not just physical, but symbolic, a perpetual assault on intuition, resilience, and moral knowing. If Eden tells the story of loss of innocence, Prometheus tells the story of the theft of power. The fire he gave wasn't just warmth, it was intellect, innovation, technology, the capacity to reach into the mind of the gods and pull out tools we were never meant to wield without consequence. And for this, he was punished, chained, torn open again and again, as if to say, this gift will never stop costing you. In both myths, we see a rupture, a shift from harmony to hierarchy, from resonance to reason, from belonging with the world to mastery over it. And whether we call it Eden or Lemuria or the veil of third density, the pattern is the same: a fall from interconnection into individuation. Blavatsky recognized this. Ra did too. Each, in their own way, traced the arc of this evolutionary turning point, the moment when awareness turned outward, and the tip of whimsy, our power to choose how to relate, began shaping the brushstrokes of polarity. What these myths preserve is not just a warning, they're a signal, a pulse from the past, a reminder of the coherence that came before cognition, of the life that pulsed before language, and perhaps of the path that might one day bring us home again, not by erasing what we've become, but by reintegrating what we forgot. Frequency wars. Among the many modern myths circulating in today's spiritual counterculture, few are as layered or as provocatively metaphorical as the transmissions channeled by Wendy Kennedy. A speaker and intuitive empath, Kennedy claims to channel information from a collective of ninth-dimensional Pleiadian beings who refer to themselves as the Pleiadian Collective. In one of her more well-known transmissions, she introduces the concept of the frequency wars, an invisible battle not fought with guns or armies, but with stories, symbols, and vibrations. In her framing, Earth is a rare and precious place in the galaxy. It's a nexus point, a richly diverse biosphere, where multiple genetic, cultural, and energetic lineages have been braided together over millions of years. A kind of interdimensional seed bank, a planetary library, a living crucible for soul evolution. And that's what makes it a target. According to Kennedy, certain groups, most notably those she refers to as Orion energies and the Anunnaki, have long sought to exert influence over Earth through frequency control, emotional manipulation, belief systems, trauma loops, and disinformation designed to distort the natural resonance of human beings. Their aim, according to this myth, is not annihilation, but stagnation. To keep Earth and its inhabitants locked into repetitive cycles of fear, shame, and conflict. To block the expansion of consciousness that, according to Kennedy and others, is now accelerating during what Ra might call the harvest. This process, she says, has reached a critical juncture between the years 2019 and 2026, a window of heightened potential, vulnerability, and choice, a pivotal phase in which human attention, more than ever before, is being pulled between coherence and chaos, contraction and evolution. Whether or not you believe in the literal existence of these extraterrestrial groups, the functional metaphor beneath Kennedy's claims invites reflection. Because even if you set aside the Anunnaki, the Orion influence, and the Pleiadian collective, the phenomenon she describes is observable in the world around you every single day. Watch a commercial. Scroll through social media. Listen to the voice in your head that tells you you're not enough. Are you being sold something, an image, a story, a product, that promises to resolve an internal discomfort that wasn't even yours until it was introduced to you? This is what Kennedy calls frequency control. And when you widen the lens, you can begin to see it, not only in consumer advertising, but in religion, in politics, in the dynamics of gaslighting between individuals, and even within the war between your own body and mind. The nervous system that signals, "I need to rest," is overridden by the mental voice that insists, "You'll fall behind." The part of you that longs for connection is silenced by the one that says, "You'll look weak." These, too, are frequency wars. And this is where Kennedy's framing dovetails with Ra's concept of third density and the veil of forgetting. We are born into a state of amnesia, surrounded by influences, biological, cultural, social, that shape the frequency of our thoughts before we even know we are thinking. The tip of whimsy, that tiny point of free attention we referenced earlier, is being tugged and teased in every direction. And if we're not careful, if we're not attentive, we don't choose how we lean, we are leaned by others. So Kennedy's message is not just about aliens or interdimensional battles. It's a call to presence, to discernment, to noticing the energetic contracts you've signed, often unconsciously, with the people, patterns, and programs that surround you. It's a plea to remember your power, the power to attune, the power to choose what you amplify. Because the stories we let into our nervous systems become the architectures we live inside. As we prepare to enter Act 2, we'll move beyond myth and metaphor to explore how stories actually shape the brain, how the fictions we inherit build neural scaffolding that supports or constrains the lives we lead, and how science, far from being immune to myth, is itself a myth-making engine, sometimes for freedom, sometimes for control. But for now, just ask yourself, what stories are you vibrating to? And whose frequency are you tuning into? Act 2. The simulation, the story, and the nervous system. In this next movement, we explore the idea of simulation. Not the kind made popular by sci-fi thrillers or YouTube philosophers, where we imagine our universe as a high-tech video game built by some outside intelligence. This isn't the Matrix. We're not talking about living inside someone else's code. We're talking about the simulation your nervous system runs every moment of your life. The simulation that evolved not to entertain, but to protect, to anticipate, to survive, to thrive. Because the real story of evolution isn't just survival of the fittest, it's survival of the thrivest. Those who could tune into patterns, who could imagine what might happen next, who could feel into the world around them, run simulations before taking action, and adapt their behavior accordingly. In other words, those who could transform story into strategy. The simulation isn't something external. It is you. It's what your neurons do. It's what your nervous system was built to create. And to understand how that simulation evolved, let's go back. And let's begin around a fire. The hunt is over. The air is cooling. A small band of humans gathers close to the flickering flame, not just for warmth, but for something older, something deeper. One hunter begins to speak. He tells a story of the day's pursuit, how he went left instead of right, how the prey slipped through the trees, how the silence that followed was heavier than he expected. His voice wavers just slightly, because this isn't just a report, it's a reliving. And as he speaks, the others listen. Their mirror neurons fire. Their nervous systems begin to simulate. Some see the forest. Others feel the choice. Each one in their own way begins to run a similar mental film. They feel the moments of indecision, the branch that snapped, the heartbeat quickening, the ache in the belly as the opportunity slipped away. And something else happens. They begin to move together. They laugh at the same moments, gasp in unison, nod unconsciously. The story is doing something. It's synchronizing them. Their breathing aligns. Their focus sharpens. Their posture shifts toward the fire. Because story, in its most ancient form, was never just content. It was a ritual, a physiological tuning fork. It was the nervous system learning how to learn, learning how to belong, learning how to carry the experiences of others as if they were its own. And the narrator, the one inside each of them who could imagine what might have been, who could mentally rehearse what to do next time, was born in that firelight. This is where the human mind becomes something different, not just reactive, not just instinctual, but imaginative, synthetic, capable of running experiments in the theater of mind, capable of regret, of wonder, of what if. And it's here, at the edge of flame and form, that we begin to understand something crucial. We didn't evolve and then learn to tell stories. We evolved because we told them. Controlled hallucination and the power of shared fiction. Before there were cities, there were stories. Before there were empires, there were myths. And long before there were words to name them, there were simulations, inner models of the world, generated not by machines or code, but by the brain itself, a colony of neurons born to protect, predict, and survive. We now turn toward a different kind of simulation. Neuroscientist Anil Seth calls it a controlled hallucination. What we experience as reality, he argues, is not pure, unfiltered, objective reality in itself, but the brain's best guess at what's happening, both inside and outside the body, shaped by prior expectations, sensory input, and ongoing physiological needs. Perception is not a window, it's a projection. And consciousness, he suggests, is what it feels like to run a simulation that you don't realize is a simulation. This isn't a flaw in the system, it's the system's genius. Because no brain, human or otherwise, can take in everything. As David Eagleman reminds us with his notion of the Umwelt, every organism is tuned to a narrow slice of reality, a sensory keyhole through which it apprehends just enough of the world to navigate it well. The brain doesn't prioritize truth. It prioritizes utility. It filters. It guesses. It fills in gaps with memory, with pattern, with meaning. Because in evolutionary terms, coherence is more valuable than completeness. And coherence for the ego requires narrative. Your nervous system is not just reacting to what is. It's constantly anticipating what might be. The feel of your next footstep, the trajectory of a facial expression, the potential meaning behind a pregnant pause. These are not static perceptions, they are rolling predictions, simulations stitched together from experience. And what makes those simulations intelligible, trackable, and transmittable is story. Story is how we package uncertainty into meaning. It's how we transform chaos into order. And while this begins inside the skull, it doesn't stay there. This brings us to the work of historian and cultural theorist Yuval Noah Harari, whose insights take this neurological reality and extend it into the social realm. In his best-selling book, Sapiens, Harari proposes that the rise of Homo sapiens as a dominant species had less to do with brute force or raw intelligence, and more to do with our ability to collaborate in flexible ways through shared beliefs. Our true superpower, he suggests, is fiction. Not as falsehood, but as intersubjective glue. Fictions that allow millions of strangers to cooperate, to organize, to construct meaning in common. Harari draws a careful distinction between objective reality, things that exist interdependently of our belief, like rocks or weather, subjective reality, the personal, interior world of dreams, emotions, and thoughts, and what he calls intersubjective reality, a third realm that exists not in the world and not within an individual, but in the shared space between people. It is a domain of mutual agreement, of cultural reinforcement, of repeated performance. Money, for example, is not an object with intrinsic value. It is a symbol whose power derives entirely from collective belief. The same is true of nations, laws, corporations, and even the idea of human rights. You cannot trip over a country or weigh a constitution, but you can kill for one. You can die for one. You can anchor your entire identity inside of one. These intersubjective realities shape behavior just as surely as gravity or hunger. and yet their existence is woven entirely from shared narrative. And far from being unnatural, these fictions are deeply biological. They are emergent properties of our meaning-making minds, symbolic outgrowths of neural hardware designed for prediction, connection, and survival. These are not just stories we tell. They are architectures we live inside. They structure the nervous system's understanding of safety, belonging, and threat. They modulate emotion, govern morality, and determine which signals the body learns to trust or dismiss. Fiction, then, is not a weakness of the human mind. It is one of its most sophisticated adaptations, a form of communal simulation that allows a species not just to survive in its environment, but to shape it, to imagine it otherwise. As we begin to see, the stories we participate in, whether religious, political, scientific, or ancestral, are not just entertainment or distraction. They are training grounds for attention. They are the scaffolding of belief, and they shape not only the world we share, but the bodies we inhabit and the brains we build to make sense of that world. This, too, is part of the frequency war. Because every fiction you've ever inherited or resisted has passed through your nervous system on its way to becoming reality. And in that process, the line between story and self begins to blur. How story becomes self. So where does this story work actually happen? What part of the brain spins these simulations, stitches together meaning, and generates the sense of self from within? Neuroscience points to a constellation of brain regions known collectively as the default mode network, or DMN for short. You don't need to memorize the term, but you already know the feeling. It's the hum of mental activity that arises when you're not focused on an external task, when your mind wanders, when you replay a conversation, when you imagine a future scenario or reflect on a choice you made long ago. This is the mode of the mind where it turns inward, scanning, reconstructing. This is where the narrator lives. The DMN isn't a single structure, but a symphony of neural players, loosely synchronized, engaging in recursive loops of memory, imagination, and internal simulation. It includes the medial prefrontal cortex, which helps construct your personal narrative and predict the mental states of others. It draws on the posterior cingulate cortex and precuneus, which integrate autobiographical memory and spatial awareness. And it loops through the angular gyrus and hippocampus, weaving together sensory fragments into cohesive temporal stories. These stories aren't passive reflections on the world. They are active constructions, shaped by the body, the breath, and the beliefs that have been layered into your nervous system across a lifetime. In this sense, the DMN is not just a cognitive backdrop. It's a meaning-making engine. A little factory, you might say. It renders the self as a process, a moving image, a constantly updating simulation of who you are, who you've been, and who you're becoming. And while it might feel like the narrator is a voice that simply reports what's happening, it actually generates your sense of reality. This is a Neil Seth-controlled hallucination at work, not just for vision or sound, but for identity itself. Your neurons are not simply perceiving reality, they are guessing at it, inferring it, assembling it from incomplete signals. And those guesses are shaped not only by your environment, but by the stories you've been taught to believe. Embedded in this network are structures like the orbitofrontal cortex, a region just behind your forehead that compares outcomes, what happened versus what could have happened. This internal reviewer flags emotional salience, especially when something feels like it didn't go according to plan. Nearby, the anterior cingulate cortex helps detect mismatches between expectation and reality. It acts like a sentry, alerting the system when the narrative loop has been disrupted or demands attention. And when these disruptions carry emotional weight, the amygdala steps in. It's not just the brain's fear center, it's the amplifier of emotional tone. It assigns urgency. It adds texture and color to the simulation, turning a simple recollection into a full-bodied event. Whether you're reliving a moment of triumph or revisiting an old ache, it's the amygdala that makes it pulse through your chest, settle in your gut, or rise in the flush of your face. These regions work together, not in isolation, but in choreography. They allow the brain to simulate not just events, but meaning. And meaning, in this framework, is not abstract. It's felt. It's physiological. It is constructed moment by moment as your neurons attempt to harmonize the story of what is with the lingering ghosts of what was and the speculative fog of what might be. And here's what's even more extraordinary. Every time you revisit a memory, every time the narrator tells the story again, the story changes. Neuroscience calls this memory reconsolidation, the process by which retrieval becomes revision. The past is not fixed. It's rewritten by the present condition under which it is recalled. Remember something in a state of fear or shame, and the memory deepens into pain. Revisit it with safety, compassion, or new perspective, and the memory softens. The pathways shift. The neurons rewire. The tip of whimsy does its thing. So the default mode network is not just the seat of distraction or rumination. It's the place where stories become structure. It's where the simulation of identity takes place, where the brain writes and rewrites the tale of who you think you are. This is where the symbolic becomes biological, where belief becomes chemistry, where fictions become patterns of prediction, attention, and action. And like any simulation, it can be distorted, especially if the inputs, the stories, the signals, the frequencies, are being shaped by forces outside your awareness, especially if the narrator is speaking in the voice of someone else, especially if you've never paused to wonder, whose story is this really? Because in a world saturated with information and distraction, reclaiming your own internal narrative is no longer just a matter of personal insight. It's a form of nervous system hygiene. The elephant, the rider, and the meaning-making mind. If the default mode network is where the narrator lives, then psychologist Jonathan Haidt gives us a way to see what kind of narrator we're actually dealing with and how it got there in the first place. In his book, The Righteous Mind, Haidt offers a metaphor that reframes how humans make decisions, not just moral or political ones, but the everyday, gut-level responses that shape behavior and belief. He says, we are not, as we like to believe, scientists weighing evidence or judges deliberating with reason. We are more like press secretaries. We justify, explain, and spin, not to arrive at truth, but to preserve a sense of coherence, to protect the identity our nervous system has already invested in. To make sense of this, Haidt introduces the image of a human as an elephant with a rider on top. The elephant is everything beneath conscious awareness: emotion, intuition, interoception, evolutionary instinct. It reacts quickly. It's big. It's powerful. It's been evolving for hundreds of millions of years. The rider, by contrast, is the conscious mind, the ego, the rational narrator. It believes it's in charge. But most of the time, it's simply interpreting the direction the elephant has already chosen. This is where Haidt's work intersects directly with the ideas of the controlled hallucination, the default mode network, and the tip of whimsy. The elephant is the conditioned nervous system. The rider is the part of us that notices, narrates, and sometimes nudges. When the system is calm, the rider can influence the elephant. When the system is dysregulated, the elephant charges, freezes, or flees, and the rider scrambles to make it make sense. Haidt demonstrated this beautifully in a series of moral intuition experiments designed to expose the order in which humans generate feeling and then story. One of his most provocative scenarios asked participants whether it would be morally wrong for an adult brother and sister to have sex one time. In the story, they're both consenting. They use protection, no one is harmed, no one ever finds out, and it never happens again. Most participants still said it was wrong. It just felt wrong. But when asked to explain why, their reasons quickly unraveled. They might get pregnant. Haidt reminded them there was birth control. They might feel traumatized. He clarified they both felt fine. It would hurt the family. No one would ever know. Even when he revealed that the pair weren't biologically related, most people still insisted it was immoral. Not because they could explain why, but because their body had already decided. The elephant had moved. The rider was trying to catch up. This wasn't about logic. It was about conditioning, acculturation, the deep unconscious imprinting of what feels right or wrong, safe or unsafe. These impressions are not formed through reason. They're inherited through culture, environment, language, and 1,000 somatic cues that accumulate over time. They're deterministic forces that shape perception long before awareness enters the room. Haidt extended this work across cultures. In India, he asked participants whether it was morally wrong for a daughter to eat before her father. Many said yes, even though no harm was caused, because it violated a sacred social order. In the United States, by contrast, participants were largely unmoved by that example. Their moral judgments were tuned more to values like fairness, harm reduction, and individual liberty. Same story, different nervous system response, different elephants. The insight here is profound. Different cultures train the elephant to respond to different frequencies. The form of morality may vary, but the function is consistent. The nervous system reacts, the rider narrates. The story of why something feels right or wrong is often built after the fact, using whatever fragments of reason can be grasped. The narrator isn't a neutral observer. It's a meaning-making machine wired for coherence and loyalty. And this matters, because when we forget that the elephant is always moving beneath us, we mistake narration for authorship. We believe we're choosing what we believe, when in fact, we're often just defending the beliefs our nervous systems have been shaped to hold. This is why mindfulness isn't just about stress relief. It's a tool for nervous system awareness. It allows the rider to pause, to sense when the elephant is activated, to listen before interpreting. When the elephant is soothed, when the body feels safe, the rider can shift from spin to stewardship. That's when the tip of whimsy becomes more than a flash of awareness. It becomes a lever, a steering mechanism, a source of genuine choice. Because the stories we tell ourselves are not just reflections of what happened, they're predictions of what happens next. And while we may not control the elephant, we can learn to travel with it, curiously, compassionately, and with just enough narrative grace to begin rewiring what it means to ride. The mind-body connection. The nervous system doesn't wait for the narrator. It moves first. Always has. That's the central insight of Stephen Porges's polyvagal theory. Beneath the stories we tell, beneath even conscious awareness, the autonomic nervous system is constantly scanning the world for cues of safety or threat. It does not reason its way through these questions. It does not consult the narrator. It listens through tone, breath, posture, inflection, and micro-expression. And before a single thought arises, the system has already responded, tightened or softened, opened or braced, flooded or frozen. Porges calls this neuroception, a pre-conscious process that evaluates risk by feel, not by logic but by vibe. Is this familiar? Is it kind? Does it resonate with past patterns of warmth or danger? If something registers as off, even subtly, the chemistry changes. Adrenaline surges. Muscles prepare. Breath shortens. And from that internal shift, a different lens is cast over reality. The elephant has moved. The rider will soon follow. This is the structure of the mind-body loop. A sensation creates a meaning, and that meaning shapes the next sensation. The vagus nerve acts as the central harmonizer in this system, a tuning fork for the nervous system's state, and every tone it picks up, whether calm or chaotic, shapes the physiological environment in which our perceptions arise. Candace Pert, the neuroscientist who discovered the opiate receptor and later coined the term molecules of emotion, showed that emotions are not simply psychological, they're chemical. Thoughts and feelings don't live exclusively in the brain. They travel. They are broadcast throughout neuropeptides to immune cells, muscle tissue, gut linings, joints, fascia. The body is not just where emotions are felt. It's where they are stored, processed, and remembered. Each emotion carries its own chemistry, its own vibrational tone. Over time, recurring emotional patterns leave a residue in the body, like a river gradually carving its way through stone. And that's where David Hawkins' map of consciousness offers another lens, one that, like Porges and Pert, affirms the body as the instrument of awareness. Hawkins mapped emotional states along a frequency scale. Emotions like shame, guilt, and regret occupy the denser, heavier ranges of his map. They contract the nervous system. They narrow perception. They reduce flexibility. Higher states like courage, willingness, or peace open the system. They widen the window. They restore coherence. Remember composite client Agatha from Chapter 10? The mother who learned to create her own inner peace when she allowed her son's shirt to remain wrinkled? When Agatha found the courage to pause, just for a moment, and the willingness to witness her old control pattern without judgment, something shifted. Not everything, but something. A loosening, a softening. She didn't need to fight herself or force change. She just breathed. And in that breath, the tone of her nervous system changed. The chemistry changed. The story began to retune. That's what Hawkins meant. Courage and willingness aren't lofty ideals. They're physiological inflection points. When we meet old patterns with just enough presence to stay, the rider begins to lean differently. And when that happens, even for a second, the elephant takes a different step. The nervous system isn't moral. It's adaptive. If a particular emotional frequency has been paired with safety or belonging in the past, the system will recreate that frequency as a form of homeostasis. even if that pattern is painful. This is how emotional tone becomes physical habit, a breath pattern, a neurochemical climate that shapes our entire lived experience. And that brings us to regret. Regret is one of the most common and most physically felt emotions we carry. It's not just a story, it's a physiological event. The chest tightens, the stomach turns, the body contracts as if preparing for impact. From the perspective of the nervous system, regret doesn't live in the past. It is not safely archived. It is active. It is present. The elephant responds as if the original mistake is still unfolding, still dangerous, still unresolved. Even when the rider tries to spin a coherent narrative, it's over now, I've learned from it, I did the best I could, the body may still be bracing. Because for the nervous system, the chemistry of regret signals unfinished business. And as long as that signal is active, the loop continues. Thought reactivates feeling. Feeling alters chemistry. Chemistry shapes perception, and the narrator, spinning to make sense of it all, may only reinforce the cycle. But here's the pivot point. These loops are not fixed. They can be interrupted, not by force, but by safety, not by analysis, but by attunement. Psychoneuroimmunology, the study of how mind, brain, and immune function interact, shows us that states like regret can be metabolized. If the body is given a signal of coherence, through breath, through presence, through warm relational cues, the chemistry begins to shift. The elephant slows. The vagus nerve softens. The neuropeptides change their message. The narrator relaxes into a different tone. The loop loosens. The story evolves. In Hawkins' terms, this shift is not about suppressing regret. It's about releasing resistance, letting the emotion move all the way through the body rather than trapping it in place. When the nervous system feels safe enough to stop contracting, even regret can become a teacher, a signal, a guide. And that's where we're headed next. Act 3. Regret, Resilience, and the Fireside Mirror. We've followed the arc of the story from myth to molecule, from the Edenic breach and Promethean flame to the simulation maps of neurons trying to make sense of themselves. Along the way, we've seen how belief systems encode not just behavior, but biology, how emotions register as tone, how stories, once repeated enough, shape the very systems that tell them. And no story captures this looping complexity like regret. Regret isn't a glitch. It's not a flaw in the machinery. It's what happens when a body built for sensation and a mind built for simulation collide. It's what happens when awareness evolves, when meaning enters the system. And sometimes, that meaning has a name. For me, one name is Tom. Tom Perry was one of the first people I ever podcasted with. We met in the early days of Mormon expression, before Infants on Thrones had a name. Back when we were just a bunch of former believers trying to make sense of what had once made sense, but now is just so frustrating. I was drawn to Tom right away, not because he had answers, but because he didn't pretend to. His questions were honest, his tone unguarded. He didn't perform for approval, he showed up. Tom's the one who came up with the name Infants on Thrones when we started that podcast. He helped shape that podcast's voice. Playful, irreverent, searching, real. And even when life pulled us in different directions, Tom remained a steady mirror. Not because we always agreed, but because his way of being reminded me, again and again, that vulnerability is a kind of wisdom. Recently, Tom asked me a question. What do you think about regret? He didn't ask with detachment. He didn't ask as a hypothetical. He asked the way people do when they're not just thinking about something, but feeling it. Because regret, as Tom described it, wasn't a concept to debate. It was a state that visited him, sometimes while lying in bed, sometimes while running, sometimes when he least expected it. A familiar shame would resurface, an awkward moment, a sharp word, a memory of how he wished he'd shown up differently with his wife, his kids, his friends, and suddenly he was flooded, frozen, embarrassed, and alone in a story his body wouldn't let him forget. It just paralyzes me, he said. Like I'm there all over again, even if it was years ago. He wasn't looking for my reassurance. He was naming something real. And beneath the words, what I heard was this. My rider is trying to steer an elephant it doesn't understand or even fully respect.
Because like you said, at the end of the day, I know I know who I'm trying to be. Not that who I am, like the person that I am today, like I'm trying to be at peace with who that person is, but I know that I want to be better tomorrow or next week or next year. So I'm constantly trying to improve myself. And if I fail or if I fall short or if I fuck up or make a mistake or embarrass myself, or that's okay. It's one of those things where like the old episodes where I used to be hyper critical, like, oh, don't put that out or whatever. It's like I was trying to live this persona or front because like I didn't want embarrassing things to come, or I didn't want things to come back and like haunt me later or fill me full of regret, you know, because that's one thing that I've always wrestled with is regret. And maybe this is something that I'd love to have a conversation with you at some point, especially now that you're in this field. But yeah, the thing that I would like to talk to you about is regret, um, and how to wrestle with that at some point because I've always wrestled with it hard, like things that I do or say that haunt me and that come back in. Like I'll just be minding my own business. Like even when I was on a run the other day, and I just got flooded with like these shameful, embarrassing moments of either fairly recently or a long time ago, just things that just hit me and it just almost paralyzes me how embarrassing it is. And that's why like I'm so vigilant, or I have been so vigilant as to try to curb that behavior now, because I want to reduce the amount of embarrassment and shame that haunt me and that keep coming back. You know, like even when I'm trying to go to sleep, sometimes my mind will wander and it'll find these like incredibly embarrassing, shameful things, or things that I regret, you know, like things that I regret saying or whatever, whether it be to my wife or my kids especially. Just stupid things like that where I'm like, God, I wish I would have been better. And it's this, I don't know if it's a perfectionism sort of thing where I want to be better. And so I'm going to be hyper vigilant and trying to repair where I am now so that I don't, because that's the ultimate goals. I do not want any more embarrassing, shameful memories to continue to haunt me, paralyze me, and to circle around my brain.
He wasn't looking for my reassurance. He was naming something real. And beneath the words, what I heard was this. My rider is trying to steer an elephant it doesn't understand or even fully respect. Because that's exactly what this is. A mismatch, a misalignment. A well-meaning narrator trying to outthink a body that has already moved, already felt, already decided something is not okay. Tom could explain the regret, rationalize it, acknowledge the growth, promise not to make the same mistake again, but none of that made the memory stop returning. None of that softened the gut, because the elephant hadn't budged. The story was still unfinished in the body. And this is where the elegant wisdom of nervous system theory comes rushing in. Stephen Porges would call this neuroception. a subcortical scanning process that happens before thought, before logic, before narrative. The body, he would say, is responding to a cue, not safe, not integrated, not resolved. And so it reacts as if the threat is still present, not because it's irrational, but because it's relational. The nervous system stores unresolved experience as a tone. Candace Pert would take it further. She would say that these unresolved emotions, these unspoken regrets, are not just thoughts that linger, they're molecules, neurochemical messengers embedded in tissue, bound to receptors in the gut, the heart, the joints, the skin. They travel along the vagus nerve. They pattern posture and pain. They become part of the felt landscape of the self. And when they're not allowed full expression, when they're resisted, ignored, or suppressed, they don't simply vanish. They wait. They echo. They loop. And David Hawkins, with his map of consciousness, would describe this state as a constriction in frequency, a compression of energy around the emotional signature of shame, guilt, or fear. He would remind us that these states are not just psychological, they're vibrational. They influence the flow of attention, the depth of breath, the openness of perception. Regret in this model is not failure, it's density, it's weight. And the work isn't to fight it, it's to stop resisting it, to bring willingness and courage back into the system, to create the conditions for movement. And that is what Tom, intuitively, is doing.
Because that's the ultimate goals. I do not want any more embarrassing, shameful memories to continue to haunt me, paralyze me, and to circle around my brain. But I think I'm going at it the wrong way, because I really think those occurrences are going to happen. What I need to do is focus on allowing it to happen, and then when I get haunted with these memories or these embarrassing things, to be okay with that. Find a way to even like laugh at it, even if it's fairly recent, where it's still kind of like go too soon, and just be like, it's okay, I fucked up, and just allow myself that grace instead of constantly trying to fix the future by saying I'm no longer going to do anything more embarrassing. And I think that's what I used to do, especially during mom expression and early in infants or whatever, where I'd be like, no, don't release that, or don't do this, or I don't like this artwork or whatever. It's like, why was I so fixated on sort of shaping this image? It's because I didn't want to do something that I would regret or I'd beat myself up for later. I hope that makes sense.
He told me that he's trying something different now. He's loosening his grip. Instead of controlling the image, preventing the embarrassment, editing the moment before it becomes shameful, he's letting the story unfold. He's letting himself feel the awkwardness, even laugh at it, even when it still stings. I think the real work, he said, is allowing it, not fixing it, not pretending it didn't happen, just letting it be what it is and being okay with that. That's not avoidance. That's not apathy. That's evolution. That's the rider learning to listen, to shift from resistance to resonance, from steering to staying. Because he's rewiring, like all of us are, always. And now he's doing it with more awareness and intention. That's where this chapter leaves us, not with a final answer, but with a new relationship to the narrator. We've seen how myth, memory, and meaning shape the stories we live inside, and how those stories shape us in return. We've watched the fall from Lemurian coherence into Atlantean overdrive, seen how the voice in our head is more echo than essence, more adaptation than truth. We've explored the science of simulation, the structure of the default mode network, the rider and the elephant, and the invisible architecture of belief. And we've traced how regret, perhaps the most human of all recursive emotions, becomes a portal, a teacher, because that's what this work is. Not silencing the narrator, but softening it, not overriding the story, but returning to the body that's been carrying it all along. As Blavatsky and Ra reminded us, we are in a density of choice, a turning point, a tip of whimsy, and every moment we lean into presence, every time we choose curiosity over control, we participate in a different kind of evolution, one that doesn't erase what came before it, but transforms it, because you're not broken, you're rewiring, and the story is still unfolding.